I hired her to milk the cows. Jacob Reed said it to a stranger on the road, a young man on a tired horse who had reined up to ask how a place like this got to be the finest in the valley. Jacob said the first part plain, the way a man says a thing he has finally made peace with. And then he looked off down the field to where a woman stood driving fence staples in the gold afternoon light, and he said the rest of it quieter. But that is the end, or near it. To know how a man comes to stand in his own green field and say a thing like that, you have to go back 4 years, to a dry afternoon in the spring of 1886. When a hired wagon came up the lane out of the Montana grass, and Jacob Reed believed he had bought himself nothing more than a pair of hands. He heard the wheels before he saw them. Nobody came up that lane. The Pruitt Range lay 6 miles north, the road to Dunbar a long hour south, and in between there was only Jacob and the cattle, and Antelope Creek running thin between its banks. He set down the bucket he'd been carrying, half its staves sprung, leaking a dark line into the dust, and walked around the corner of the house. The homestead did not look like much, and he knew it. The barn roof had a swayback. The garden Eleanor used to keep was a square of weeds gone to seed, the fence around it leaning the way a drunk leans on a rail. 2 years he'd let it go. 2 years since the fever, and the place had been quietly coming apart in his hands, board by board, like the land itself was taking it back. The wagon stopped. A woman climbed down before the driver could come around to help her. She wore a gray traveling dress, gone tan with dust at the hem, and a flat straw bonnet she'd pushed back off her head so it hung by its ribbon, brown hair, pinned up, a few strands loose. Not young, past 30, he judged, with a square, sun-touched face and eyes that didn't waste time on his. They went past him, to the sway-backed barn, to the dead garden, to the leaking bucket in the dust. She took the whole of it in before she ever looked at the man who owned it. "Mr. Reed," she said, "not a question. That's me." He wiped his palms down his trousers. "You'll be the Bennett woman, Sarah Bennett." She lifted a single-corded trunk down from the wagon bed herself, set it on the ground, and stood with one hand resting on it. "You wrote to the marriage agency that advertises in the Eastern papers," I answered. He had, or his name was on the letter. Mrs. Cobb, down at the Mercantile, had done most of the writing, sitting at his kitchen table with her spectacles down her nose, saying a man couldn't run a dairy and a garden and a herd alone and grieve at the same time, and she would not stand by and watch him starve out of pride. He'd signed because it was easier than arguing. He'd never once believed a soul would answer. He took a folded paper from his shirt pocket and held it out to her across the dust. "I wrote it down," he said, "so there's no confusion on it. Milk the 2 cows, morning and night. Keep a kitchen. Keep the house from falling in around our ears. That's the whole of the arrangement. I'll not pretend it's more than that." Sarah Bennett did not take the paper. She looked at it a moment, the way you look at a thing a child has made, and then she looked past him again, out beyond the leaning garden fence to where the ground dropped away toward the creek bottom, where the grass grew a darker, richer green than any other ground on the place. She did not go to the cows. She walked the fence line down toward the dry creek, slow, her skirt dragging a clean line through the dust, and stopped and crouched and put her bare hand flat against the dirt. Supper that first night was a quiet, careful thing. She'd found the kitchen the way he'd left it. Flour gone to weevils, a coffee pot with a week of grounds dried in the bottom, one good lamp and one with a cracked chimney. By dusk she had bread of a sort and beans and salt pork on the table, and coffee that didn't taste like the inside of a boot. Jacob ate with his hat off and his eyes on his plate. He'd forgotten what it was to have a second chair filled. He found he didn't quite know where to put his hands. "The cows," he said, because the silence had gone on long enough to need breaking. "Brindle's the easy one. The roan'll kick if you come at her cold. You want to talk to her first. I've milked cows, Mr. Reed. I expect you have." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the boards. "I'm only saying." She buttered a piece of bread with the last of the butter gone half rancid in the crock, and ate it without complaint, and that told him something, though he couldn't have said what. When she'd cleared the plates, she lit the second lamp off the first and carried it to the shelf by the window, where Eleanor's ledger still sat under a finger of dust. He saw her see it. He waited for her to open it. She didn't. She set the lamp beside it and left it lie, and went out to look at the sky before bed, and he was grateful to her for that without understanding why. He gave her the bed, Eleanor's bed, with Eleanor's quilt, and he stood in the doorway a moment with the lamp before he could make himself say it was hers now and turn away. He took the barn and a horse blanket and a saddle for a pillow, and lay awake a long time in the straw smell and the dark, listening to the roan shift in her stall, and the new woman's lamp burned down behind the one-lit window of his house, and thought, Thursday. There's a coach back to Dunbar Thursday. She'll see what this place is by Thursday. See the swayback barn and the dead garden and the man who couldn't keep either, and be glad enough to climb on it. She was up before him. He came out into a gray dawn to the sound of milk hitting steady and unhurried, and there she was on the stool with her forehead against the roan's flank, talking low to the mean cow the way he'd told her to, and the roan standing for it like a lamb. 2 full pails by the door, foam still on them. She didn't say good morning. She said, Your spring's not dead, it's choked. Jacob stopped in the barn door. My what? The spring that fed this place. She stood, lifted the pails, carried them past him toward the house. Come and look when you've had your coffee. I'll show you, he told himself. He went to set her straight. That was all. She walked him down past the leaning garden, down the slope where the grass ran dark and rich, to the bank of Antelope Creek, where the cattle watered. And there, half buried in silt and a tangle of wild rose, she showed him a thing he had walked past 1,000 times and never once seen. A low timber box sunk into the bank, gray and rotten, a wooden gate gone off its rod. She knelt and worked the muck out of it with her bare fingers, and where the silt came away, he could see the cut of an old channel running back up the slope, grown over, shallow as a wrinkle in a blanket, but there, running clear up under the garden, up toward the bottomland. Somebody dug a ditch off this creek, she said, years back. Headgate here, sluice running up to water, that bottom ground and the garden both. Then they let it silt and the spring above it choke behind the dam of it, and the whole thing went to sleep. She looked up at him, dirt to her wrists. That black ground down there isn't poor, Mr. Reed. It's the best land in this valley. It's just thirsty. Somebody walked off and let it go thirsty. Jacob looked at the rotten box. He thought of Eleanor, 3 summers back, saying something about the low field, about a ditch, about her father's people knowing water, and him only half listening, his mind on a sick steer. He had not thought of it once since she died. He had not let himself think of much. That somebody's been gone 2 years, he said. And what's under that garden is weeds, and what I hired was a milkmaid. It came out harder than he meant it. You were hired to milk cows, not to dig up my creek. Sarah Bennett wiped her hands slowly on her apron. She did not look hurt. She looked the way a person looks at weather coming, measuring it, deciding what it meant for the work. All right, she said. She stood and took up the pails and walked back to the house and milked and churned and cooked and swept for 3 more days and said not one word more about the ditch. Jacob told himself he'd won the thing. On the 4th morning he woke in the barn to a sound that wasn't the cows, a steady chuck of iron into dirt. He came out rubbing his face, the sun not yet over the ridge, and walked down past the garden and stopped. Sarah was in the creek bottom, on her knees in the wet, digging out the silted ditch by hand, and she was doing it with Eleanor's garden spade, the one with the worn ash handle, the one that had hung untouched on its nail in the barn for 2 years. Put that down. She didn't. She drove the spade in again, levered up a black wet wedge of silt, and laid it on the bank, and reached for the next. That's not yours to use. His voice came up out of somewhere he kept shut. That spade. Put it back where it hangs. Sarah straightened on her knees. She looked at the worn ash handle in her hands, and then at him, and she set the spade down across her thighs. Careful, the way you set down a thing that has weight beyond its weight. Whose was it? She said. My wife's. The word came out of him like a stone he'd been carrying under his tongue. Eleanor's. She kept the garden. That ground you're standing in. She kept all of it. And I kept the cattle, and that was how it went. And then she took the fever in the spring, and by summer she was. He stopped. The creek ran on behind her, thin and brown. And I let it go. All of it. Because I couldn't stand to walk past it. For a long moment Sarah didn't speak. A meadowlark started up, somewhere in the grass, and quit. My father had 400 acres in the Dakota Territory, she said at last. She said it to the ditch, not to him. Good black ground, same as this. He didn't understand water. Wouldn't be told. The creek ran low, 2 summers running, and he watched his corn burn, standing, because he was too proud to dig a ditch a neighbor offered to help him cut. She turned the spade over in her hands. We lost the claim to the bank when I was 19. I watched my mother pack a house into one trunk. I swore I'd never again stand by and let good land die for want of somebody willing to bend their back. She held the spade out to him, handle first. But it's yours, and it's hers. So you tell me, Mr. Reed, do I put it back on the nail, and we both watch this place go under, or do I keep digging? Jacob looked at the spade. At the worn place where Eleanor's hand had gone year on year. He did not take it. She'd not have wanted it on a nail, he said. His throat had gone tight. Keep digging. So she dug, and after a while, without a word, he went to the barn and got the second spade and came down and dug beside her. It took the better part of a week to open the first 30 yards of ditch. They worked it in the early cool and the late gold, silt to their elbows, the wet black muck, giving off a smell like a creek bottom in spring, cool and green and rotten sweet. Jacob found muscles he'd forgotten he owned. He found, too, that the work emptied his head, in a way the cattle never had. There was no room in it for grief, only the next spadeful, the next root to cut. The slow argument of a man and a woman with 200 yards of buried water. Sarah worked ahead of him, reading the old channel where he couldn't see it at all. She'd stop and lay her palm flat on a patch of grass that looked no different to him than any other and say, "Here, it turns here," and she'd be right, the rotten timber lining turning up under the spade just where she'd said. "How do you know it?" he asked her on the 4th evening, leaning on the handle. "There's nothing to see. The grass knows." She didn't look up. "Water ran here 40 years, and the grass remembers it even when the men forgot. Look how it greens darker along the line. The ground tells you, if you've learned to be told." He looked. And once she'd said it, he could see it. A faint, dark seam of richer green running up the dead slope, the ghost of a creek that men had made and let die. He thought of Eleanor, saying, "The ground talks to you, Jacob. You've only got to hush long enough to hear it." And him laughing, and her not minding that he laughed. On the 7th evening, Sarah knocked the last plug of muck out of the headgate and stood back, and Jacob watched a thread of brown water find the channel they'd cut and run, hesitating down it, feeling its way, soaking in, then running again, down the slope, under the leaning fence, into the cracked gray bed where the garden had been. He stood in the wet of it before he knew he'd stepped in. The water came up cool around his boots. He could not have told anyone why his eyes stung. "That's water on it," Sarah said quietly beside him. "Now we'll see what it remembers." They drove to Dunbar that Saturday for seed. The town was 3 streets and a church with a good bell, and the mercantile sat on the corner with barrels out front. Mrs. Cobb came around the counter when she saw who'd come in, looked Sarah up and down once, and pronounced, "Well, you're real. I'd half decided he'd dreamed you." She took to Sarah inside of 10 minutes the way she took to few people. The two of them leaned over the counter, trading talk of seed and hens and of coffee, while Jacob stood by the door, turning his hat. When Sarah set a crock of butter on the counter, the first good butter off the place in 2 years, worked sweet and firm and pale gold, Mrs. Cobb wiped a thumb across the top, tasted it, and went quiet. "That's springgrass butter," she said. "Off that creek bottom." She looked at Sarah over her spectacles. "I sold Eleanor Reed's butter on this counter 11 years. Hers tasted just so." She set the lid back on the crock, gentle. "I'll take all you make, every week. Coin, not credit. And I'll tell folks where it's from." She nodded toward Jacob without looking at him. "About time something came off that place but sorrow." It was on the walk back to the wagon that the trouble found them, the way trouble does, wearing a clean hat. Reed, a big sorrel horse, a big man on it, a coat too good for a Saturday. Hollis Pruitt looked down at Jacob, and then, a beat longer at Sarah, and something in his face arranged itself into amusement. Heard you'ds sent away for company. Didn't credit it. He shifted his weight in the saddle, leather creaking. Listen, when you tire of throwing good money after a played-out quarter section, you come see me. I'll take that bottomland off your hands fair. Save you the trouble of watching it die slow. He touched his hat brim to Sarah, all courtesy. Ma'am. Hate to see a sensible woman waste herself on poor ground. It's not poor ground, Mr. Pruitt, Sarah said. Pleasant. Certain. It's just been waiting on somebody to bother. Pruitt smiled, like she'd said something charming, and rode on. Jacob said nothing the whole hour home. But twice he looked over at the woman on the seat beside him, and the second time he almost spoke, and didn't. They came up the lane at dusk to the smell of turned earth and creek water, and the low green of the bottomland just beginning to show against the dark, and reined up short. A big sorrel horse stood at their garden fence. Hollis Pruitt sat at easy in the last light, hat pushed back, looking down the slope at the new wet ditch and the green coming up out of the dead ground. And on his face was a thing that was no longer amusement at all. Pruitt didn't get down off his horse. Men like him made you stand below them. It was half their business. Reed! He nodded at the bottomland where the green ran in a long damp tongue down toward the creek. That's a clever piece of work. Whose idea? Mine, Sarah said before Jacob could answer. Pruitt looked at her the way a man looks at a dog that's done a trick. Then he turned back to Jacob, and his voice went down into business. I'll make it plain, neighbor to neighbor. I'm offering $800 for the whole quarter. House, barn, stock, the lot. That's better than this place has been worth since your wife passed, and we both know it. He let that sit. And I'll tell you something for free, because I'd as soon you took the money clean. That creek of yours comes off my range. Antelope rises in my high pasture. A man can do a deal of things with water that rises on his own ground. He gathered his. Rains $800. The offer's good till haying. After that, I expect this ditch business will have sorted itself out without me lifting a finger. He rode off into the dark. The hoofbeats went a long time. Jacob stood at his own fence and felt the old want come up in him, the want to be shut of the place, the grief, the leaking buckets, all of it, for $800 and a clean road out. He'd have taken it a month ago. He'd have taken it gladly. You're thinking on it, Sarah said. I'm thinking a month ago I'd have signed before he finished talking. And now? He looked down the slope at the green coming up out of the ground he'd given up for dead. Now I've got water on it, he said, and I find I want to see what it remembers. She didn't smile, but something in her shoulders let go, and she went in and lit the lamp. What followed was the best summer Jacob Reed had had in longer than he'd admit. They re-timbered the sluice with green cottonwood, Sarah holding the boards level and Jacob sawing, the two of them learning each other's hands by the work. She was particular past anything he'd known. A board a half-inch out, and she'd have it up and reset. No temper in it, just the certainty that water punished sloppy work, and you might as well do it right the once. He'd have called it fussing in another, in Eleanor even, but he watched the rebuilt headgate lift clean on its new rod and seat tight with never a drip, and he held his peace. Where'd you learn carpentry? He asked her, fitting the gate. Watching men who wouldn't let me hold the saw. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. You learn a deal, standing where they think. You're only watching. They opened the ditch the rest of the way up, 200 yards of it, grubbing out 40 years of root and silt, until the water ran where some forgotten settler had meant it to run. And the bottomland came on like a thing waking hungry. First the wild grass, thickening to a green he could see deepen week on week. Then the kitchen garden Sarah had laid out in the old plot. Potatoes and beans and a long row of squash and a corner of herbs she said her mother's had grown. Then the low hayfield, greening up where it had been gray since the year of the fever. The two cows freshened on the rich grass, and the milk came heavier, sweeter, the pails coming up to the house with a finger of cream standing on each. Sarah set a cheese press going in the cool of the cellar, a thing of oak and an iron screw that she had Jacob build off a drawing she made in the dust with a stick, having watched her mother work one as a girl. Where there had been 1 crock of butter a week, there were now 5, worked pale and sweet in Eleanor's old churn that Sarah had scalded clean and brought back to use, and rounds of cheese curing on the cellar shelf under cloth, and eggs from the hens she'd doctored back into, laying with a handful of crushed shell and a clean coop. Nothing she touched stayed idle. The place that had been quietly dying began, just as quietly, to pay. Jacob found himself working harder than he had in years, and minding it less. He'd come up at noon to find a real dinner on a swept table. He'd hear her out at the cows in the blue dark of morning, talking low to the mean roan, and the roan answering by standing still. He started fixing things he'd let go, the barn roof first, hauling up cedar shakes and nailing through the long, warm afternoons. Then the porch step that had rocked underfoot for 2 years. Then the garden fence, planing the leaning posts straight one evening for no reason he could name, except that he didn't like to see it lean anymore. Each Saturday the buckboard went to Dunbar, heavier than the last, butter and cheese in the cool of a wet sack, eggs packed in straw, and came back with coin in the tin, and a little more besides. He caught himself one evening whistling a thing he hadn't whistled since before the fever, and stopped, ashamed. And then, standing alone in his own mended barn with the swallows coming in under the new roof, the muvvered new roo, let himself go on whistling it. They didn't speak of the arrangement. The folded paper with its 3 chores had gone into a drawer and stayed there. But neither did they speak of anything past the work, and there was a carefulness between them, a held breath, like 2 people sharing a narrow bridge. It broke open on a warm night in July. He came up from latching the head gate and found her on the porch in the dark, not working, just sitting in the rocking chair, Eleanor's chair, with a tin cup of cooling coffee in her hands. He stopped on the step. He'd not seen anyone in that chair in 2 years. It moved through him sharp, and then it eased, and he found a place against the rail and stayed. The crickets were loud. A hand-stitched quilt of Eleanor's lay folded over the rail, aired out where Sarah had hung it that morning, and the smell of it, cedar and old cotton, came faint on the warm air. "You'd have liked her," he said. It surprised him to hear himself. Eleanor. She was small, and she was stubborn, and she ran this place around me like I was a post she had to mow around. I thought I was the one holding it up. He turned his cup in his hands. Then she was gone, in 11 weeks, start to finish, and I found out I couldn't make the butter or read her ledger or keep the garden from going to seed. I couldn't do any of it. I'd been standing in the middle of a thing she built and calling it mine. Sarah rocked, slow. The chair gave its old creak. "That's why the chore's on the paper," she said, not unkind. "You hired her back. The parts of her you could pay for." It landed in him like a hand laid flat on a bruise. He didn't answer for a while. "I didn't know that's what I was doing," he said. "I know you didn't." She set the cup on the rail. "I came west for ground under my feet, Mr. Reed. I'll be honest with you, since we're being honest in the dark where it's cheaper. I didn't come for a husband. I came because a woman alone, with no claim and no money, has about 3 roads open to her, and I didn't care for 2 of them. I figured I'd milk your cows and keep your house and have a roof, and that would be a fair trade and nobody owing anybody." She looked out at the dark where the bottomland lay. "I didn't figure on the land, on finding water under a place somebody'd given up on. That's done something to me I didn't plan for." "Done what?" "Made me want to stay," she said simply. "Pass the trade." The crickets filled the long quiet after that. Neither of them moved to fill it with anything else. After a time she rose and said good night and went in, and Jacob stood at the rail until the lamp went out behind the window, and then a while longer. In the morning he walked down to start the water and found the ditch low, not dry, low. The head gate stood open full, and the creek behind it had dropped a hand's width overnight, the brown water sliding through where it had run brimming the day before. He stood looking at it a long moment, not understanding, and then he climbed the slope to where he could see up the valley, north, toward the high country and the Pruitt Range. A mile up, where Antelope Creek came down off the open ground, men were at work in the early light, wagons, a team dragging timber, and across the narrow throat of the creek, already a third of the way up, the raw new face of an earthen dam. "He can't do that," Jacob said in the Mercantile that afternoon. "Can he? Dam a creek that runs through 3 men's places." Mrs. Cobb set down the butter crock she'd been weighing. It was Sarah who answered. "He can dam water that rises on his own land, if nobody's claimed a right below him," she said. "That's the law of it out here. First in time, first in right. Whoever put a ditch to use first holds the senior right, and Pruitt can't dry him up no matter where the water rises." She was quiet a beat. "The question is whether anybody ever filed on that old ditch of ours, or whether it's been asleep so long the right went to sleep with it." Jacob hadn't known there was such a thing as filing on a ditch. Eleanor's people might have. Eleanor's people had dug it. That was where the ledger saved him. He'd never been able to read it. Eleanor's small slanted hand had always looked to him like bird tracks, and after she died he couldn't stand to try. Sarah sat down with it at the kitchen table that night under the good lamp and went through it page by page, and a little before midnight she went still and turned the book around and put her finger on a line. "Filed water right, Antelope Creek," she read aloud. "April 1879, 100 inches. Headgate at the lower bend. Recorded at the county seat. Eleanor's father's name. The receipt number copied out in that careful hand. 1879, Sarah said. "Pruitt didn't come into this valley till 81, I asked Mrs. Cobb." She looked up, and for the first time since she'd come, something fierce moved in her face. "Your wife's people hold the senior right on this creek by 2 years, Mr. Reed. That dam he's building doesn't dry us up. By law, it can't touch us. We just have to make him answer to the paper." It took 3 weeks, and a long, dusty ride to the county seat. 2 days each way with a night at a wayside house that smelled of bacon, grease, and harness oil. Jacob had never set foot in a courthouse in his life. He stood in the cool stone hall with his hat in his hands while Sarah told the clerk what she wanted, plain and exact, the receipt number off Eleanor's ledger copied on a scrap of paper. And the clerk went away into a room of leather books and came back an hour later with a great ledger of the county's own and laid it open on the counter and turned it to face them. And there it was, inked in another hand, in another year, the Antelope Creek filing. April of 1879, 100 inches, the headgate at the lower bend, the name of Eleanor's father written out full, real as a fence post, older than Pruitt's claim by 2 clear years. Sarah put her finger on it and looked at Jacob, and Jacob looked at a dead man's name in a county book, holding up his whole life, and had to turn and study the window a moment before he could speak. It was paper that did the rest of it, every bit. A copy made under the clerk's seal, and a letter from the water commissioner writing out to Pruitt's with the law folded in his saddlebag. There was no shouting on the Reed place, and no rifle ever came down off its pegs. One evening, a rider Jacob didn't know came down from the north and opened the headgate on the new dam afoot, and the next morning Antelope Creek ran brimming again through the lower bend, and that was the whole of the battle. Pruitt had built his dam. The law made him share the water under it. He was a man who knew when a thing was settled, and he didn't waste temper on it. What surprised Jacob more was the valley. When word got round how it had gone, the widowers played out quarter holding a senior right that brought Hollis Pruitt to heel without a shot. The neighbors who'd written the Reed place off 2 years back found reasons to drive their wagons up the lane. Some came to see the ditch. Some came to taste the cheese they'd heard about at the Mercantile. By August, Reed butter was the butter folks asked for in Dunbar by name, and the cheese went the same way, and Sarah's garden truck. Beans and squash and new potatoes and a glory of tomatoes off the watered ground went to town in a loaded buckboard twice a week and sold off the wagon before she could get it to the Mercantile. There was a stretch of green down the creek bottom that men reined up to look at the way they'd look at a fine horse, and more than one of them got down and walked the ditch with Jacob, asking how it was done, and Jacob found himself explaining senior rights, headgates, and the dark seam of grass that tells you where water used to run. Words that had been Sarah's a season ago and were his now, and it gave him a quiet pride he was careful not to show too much of. In September, the Hendersons up the road the barn raised a new barn, and the whole valley came, and the Reeds with them. Jacob hadn't been to a gathering since the funeral. He'd kept clear of them the way you keep clear of a sore tooth. The church socials, the threshing crews, the Sunday dinners folks had stopped asking him to once they'd seen how he sat at them. He stood now at the edge of the Henderson barn, raising with a plate he wasn't eating from, and watched Sarah move through the women at the long tables like she'd been born into them. And she had. He understood. She'd been raised at gatherings like this, a homesteader's daughter among homesteaders, until the bank took the ground out from under her family and scattered them across the territories like chaff. She laughed at something, one of the Henderson girls said. She set out a dried apple pie she'd carried up wrapped in a cloth, and 3 women crowded it, and a 4th asked her how she'd got the crust to do that. And Sarah told her, and the woman nodded like she'd been given something. The men had the barn frame up by mid-afternoon, the bents rising one after another to a great shout, each time the smell of new-sawn pine and sweat and somebody's pipe on the warm air. A fiddle started up under the lanterns, strung in the half-built loft. A woman he half knew, Ada Fry from the church, drifted over beside him with a cup of cider and watched the dancing a while. "That's a fine woman you found yourself, Jacob Reed," she said. "We'd all about decided you meant to grieve yourself into the ground." She nodded toward the tables, where Sarah was ladling something for a child. "How long have you two been married, then?" "I'm ashamed to say I never heard the day." The fiddle turned over into a slow tune. Lantern lights swung gentle across the new rafters. Jacob opened his mouth to say it. The hired arrangement. The folded paper. The 3 chores. And the fair trade. And nobody owing anybody. He'd said it plain enough to Pruitt's face on the road that first Saturday. Sent away for company. A milkmaid. Nothing more. The word wouldn't come. "A while now," he heard himself say. And then, because Ada Fry was waiting, and the truth of it had gotten somewhere ahead of him, long enough, "I can't well remember the place without her." Ada patted his arm, satisfied, and went back to the women, and Jacob stood holding a plate he wasn't eating from and lanterns from, and watched the wife he had not married laugh under the lantern light, and felt the bottom go out of something he'd been standing on for 2 years, and was not sorry. They drove home late, under a sky thick with stars, the child-sized warmth of the cider still in him, Sarah half asleep against the seatback with the empty pie cloth folded in her lap. But by the time they turned up their own lane, the stars in the west had gone, swallowed not by cloud, but by a high, thin haze, and the night had no cool in it, at all, none, the way late September nights ought to have. Jacob had ranched this valley 20 years. He knew the feel of weather, and this was a wrongness he could taste, dry and metallic at the back of his throat. In the morning, the well-digger from Dunbar was out at the Henderson place, and word came up the road by noon. The man had been working valleys in this country 30 years, and he stood at the lip of the Henderson's well, looking down at how far the rope had to run before it wetted. And he told them flat he'd not seen the water lie this low, nor the grass cure out this early, in 20 years. "Set yourselves for a dry one," he said. "The driest any of you have got." The dry held. It held through that fall and never broke, and the new year came up out of the ground, thirsty behind it. The spring runoff that should have filled Antelope Creek bank to bank came thin and brief, and was gone by May. By the next July, the whole valley had gone the color of a lion's hide. The grass cured standing, the seed heads rattling dry in a wind that carried no rain in it, only dust and the smell of hot stone. Every place in the valley browned and shrank that summer. Every place but one. Down in the Reed Creek bottom, the bottomland stayed green. The ditch did it, the ditch and the old senior right, and Sarah's stubborn management of every inch of water that came through the head gate. She'd cut the flow to the garden to a trickle morning and night, and run the rest onto the hayfield, and where the rest of the valley was selling off thin cattle for what they'd bring. The Reed herd grazed a green strip down the creek and held their flesh. Men drove miles to look at it. It was the one living thing for 20 miles, and Jacob knew, the way you know weather, that a green field in a brown year draws eyes the way water draws stock. It drew the bank first. The note came up from Dunbar in the second week of July, carried by the banker's own clerk, who would not meet Jacob's eye. $340, principal and interest, and, against the place, a note, Eleanor, or had taken to buy the second team and the breeding stock, back when there'd been 2 of them to carry it. Jacob had let it ride 2 years, paying the interest when he could, and not when he couldn't. Now the bank wanted it cleared. Drought made bankers nervous, and a nervous bank pulls in its paper. There was no malice in it, and that was almost the worst of it. The clerk shook his hand, said the bank surely valued Mr. Reed's custom. Said times being what they were, the directors had thought it prudent. Said it all soft and sorry, and rode back to town having put a noose, however gentle, around the only green field in the valley. Jacob stood in the yard and watched the dust of him go, and felt the old want to be shut of it all come up in him again, stronger now for having something to lose. He sat at the kitchen table that night with the note in front of him, and the note in front of him, Eleanor's ledger beside it, and the lamp turned low to save oil, and he did the thing he'd been dreading, which was the arithmetic. The butter and cheese and garden money had come in steady all summer. It had. But he'd put it into seed and timber and a new milk cow and the courthouse fees into the place, every dollar back into the place, the way you do when a thing is finally growing. And there was not $340 in the coffee tin behind the flour. There was $160. Pruitt's offer sat in his mind like an open door. $800, the man had said, a year back. It would be less now, with the note bought 100 times. With the note known and the drought on, but it would be enough to clear the bank and walk away with money in his pocket and no green field for anybody to covet. Sarah came in from the cows and saw his face and the paper in the tin and understood all of it without a word, the way she understood weather. "How short?" she said. Short enough. He couldn't look at her. "Sarah, I'm going to say a thing and you're going to let me say the whole of it." He turned the tin cup a quarter turn, on the boards, the old habit. "You came here for ground under your feet, I know that. And this ground to go out from under times. And this ground's about to go out from under both of us. And there's no sense you going down with a place that was already half drowned when you got off that wagon. You've made it worth more than it was. Pruitt'll pay something on the strength of what you built. Take a share of it, you earned it twice over, and go to a place that isn't dying. I'll not hold you to a paper I signed when I wasn't thinking straight. You're free of it. You've been free of it." For a long moment the only sound was the dry wind working at the window. Then Sarah pulled out the second chair and sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and did not reach for the door he'd opened. "You want to know what the third road was," she said. "The one I wouldn't take, that I told you about on the porch. After the bank took my father's place." She looked at him steady in the low light. "I was 20. There was a man in the town below us who'd marry a girl with no money if she'd nurse his sick wife and his children and ask nothing. And when the wife died, he'd keep her on the same terms and call it Christian charity. And I saw exactly what my life would be, down to the last gray year of it. I ran from that, Jacob. I came 2,000 miles and answered an advertisement from a stranger sooner than spend my life being useful to a man who'd never once see me." Her hands didn't move. "And then I got off the wagon at a place everybody'd given up on, and the man who'd hired me to milk his cows stood in the creek and cried over the water coming back. And I thought, there's a man who can still feel a thing. I'll stay and see." She leaned forward, and the lamp put a small fierce light in her eyes. "I'm not leaving because the year's dry. I left dry years before when there was nothing to stay for. There's something to stay for now." She reached over and drew the ledger to her side of the table and opened it to a clean page and took up the pencil. "Now turn that lamp up. We'll pay the bank and keep the place both, and I'll show you how. But I'll not do sums in the dark to save a nickel of oil while we lose $300. Turn it up." He turned it up. They worked the figures past midnight. what the cheese would bring through harvest, what the hay would fetch, standing in a year nobody else had any, what the herd was worth held instead of sold. And they were still short, and they both knew where the short was made up, and neither set it in water, in holding every senior inch of Antelope Creek through the worst of the dry. Everything turned on the ditch, running full. Jacob woke before dawn to a house gone quiet wrong. The bed where Sarah slept was made up cold, the lamp was out. He came down into the gray yard, pulling his suspenders up, and saw the barn door standing open, and the second team gone from their stalls, and out past the garden, faint in the half-light. The buckboard was already a small shape, moving up the dry creek, north, toward the high ground, toward the throat of the valley, where Hollis Pruitt's earthen dam held back what little water was left in the world. Jacob caught the saddle horse and rode after her, with his heart going hard and not over the water. He found the buckboard pulled up below the dam, and Sarah standing at the foot of it, small against the raw earth wall, and Hollis Pruitt come down from his house on the big sorrel with two of his hands behind him. The creek above stood in a shrunken brown pool. Below it, in the channel that should have fed half the valley, there was a stand of cracked mud. There was a stand of cracked mud and a thread of water you could have stepped across. Jacob came off the horse between them before he'd thought about it. "Whatever this is," he said, "it's mine to settle, not hers. It's nobody's to settle," Sarah said, without taking her eyes off Pruitt. "It's settled." It was settled at the courthouse a year ago. She had a leather wallet in her hands, and she opened it, and there it was, the recorded filing under the clerk's seal, and folded with it the water commissioner's order from the summer before. She held them up, not waving them, just holding them where the light could find them. "Senior right, Mr. Pruitt. 1879, 100 inches at the lower bend. You signed that you understood it last August, in front of the commissioner. That gate's been closed 3 days. By that paper you owe my creek 100 inches, before you water one steer of your own, drought or no drought." Pruitt sat his horse and looked down at her a long while. His hands shifted behind him. The dry wind moved over the bare ground between them, and nobody filled the quiet. "My cattle are dying up here," Pruitt said at last. Quiet. Not a threat. Closer to the truth than Jacob had ever heard out of him. "You understand that? I built this to save my own stock, and there's 100 head behind me with their tongues swelling." "I know it," Sarah said, and her voice changed, not soft, but level. The voice of one homesteader to another over a thing they both understood in the bone. "I lost a place to a dry year and a man too proud to share water, Mr. Pruitt. I'm not here to dry you out. The law gives me 100 inches. It doesn't give me a drop more, and your dam can hold every inch above that and keep your herd alive. Open the gate to the line, and we both come through this summer. Keep it shut and you break a court order in a year the whole valley's watching, and you lose more than water." She lowered the papers. "I'd sooner you opened it, because it's right. But open it." For a moment Jacob thought it would go wrong anyway. That pride would do in Hollis Pruitt what sense couldn't. Then the big man let out a breath through his nose, and nodded once to the hand on his left, and nodded once to the hand on his left, and the man climbed the face of the dam and put his weight to the gate, and worked it up. Water moved. It came down the dry channel slow at first, dark, pushing a roll of dust and dead leaves ahead of it, then steadied and ran, 100 inches of it, brown and alive, sliding down toward the lower bend and the lower bend and the headgate and the green bottomland waiting for it. Jacob watched it go and felt the same thing he'd felt the first evening in the cracked garden, only bigger, and he didn't try to hide it this time. "You filed on a ditch," Pruitt said to Sarah, almost wondering. 2 years asleep, and you filed on it." He shook his head. "Read, when this dry breaks, I'll buy that hay off you standing. A man who holds water in a year like this is a man I'd sooner trade with than fight." He reined the sorrel around, and that was the whole of it. No shot, no blow. Just water running, and a man who knew when a thing was settled. The summer turned on that 100 inches. It was no easy thing even then. 100 inches in a drought year was a thing you spent like a dying man's last coin, and Sarah spent it close. She had Jacob up before light, to run the night's flow onto the part of the field that needed it worst, and shut the garden down to a cupful at the roots of each hill. And they carried water in buckets to the things the ditch couldn't reach, the two of them and the hired boy, stumbling the rows in the red dawn. The dust got into everything, his teeth, the creases of his hands, the corners of his eyes. The cattle bawled at the dry hills and crowded the green strip. Some nights he fell into the bed, too tired to pull his boots, and heard her come in just as weary, and neither of them had a word left, and it didn't matter, because the want of words between them had stopped being a wall and turned into something more like a roof the garden held. The hayfield came on heavy and green in a valley gone to dust, and when the first cutting went up, Jacob had stacks of hay standing in a year nobody else had a forkful, the sweet cured smell of it rolling off the stackyard, and Pruitt was the first of 6 men to buy it, at a price Jacob would have called a sin in a wet year, the cheese cured on the cellar shelves. Mrs. Cobb sold every round and asked for more. And on a bright hot morning in August, Jacob Reed drove into Dunbar and laid $340 on the banker's desk in coin and small bills and the bank's own draft against the hay, and walked out owning his ground clear for the first time since Eleanor died. He didn't drive straight home. He sat the buckboard a while at the edge of town where the road bent toward the place, and thought about a folded paper in a drawer with 3 chores written on it, and how far a thing could travel from where it started. She was at the head gate when he came up the lane, kneeling, clearing a snag of grass out of the run, the way she did a dozen times a day. The water came through clean past her hands and ran down to the green. She looked up at the sound of the wagon, dust on her wrists, a strand of brown hair loose against her sun-browned face. And Jacob got down and walked to her through the wet grass, and stood there with his hat in his hands, and found he'd run out of all the careful distance he'd kept for 2 years. "Bank's paid," he said. "Place is clear." He turned the hat brim in his fingers. "Sarah, I had a paper made up the day you came, with 3 things written on it, 'cause 3 things was all I had the nerve to want from anybody. I've not looked at it in a year, and I'd as soon burn it." His throat worked. "I didn't hire a wife. I know that's the word on the paper. But I'm asking you now, plain, the way I should have had the sense to ask a year ago, not to milk the cows, not to keep the house, to stay because you want to, as my wife. The real word, the one in front of a preacher, if you'll have a worn-out cattleman who took a year too long to say it." Sarah stood, slow, the water running between them. "I told you on the porch I wanted to stay past the trade," she said. Her eyes were bright and steady. "You took your time hearing it." "I'm slow," he said. "Ask the roan." She laughed. The first time he'd heard her laugh that wasn't for company, and she put her dirt-streaked hand in his there, in the running water. And that was the answer. And neither of them said anything more for a while because there wasn't any need. They were married in the Dunbar church before the leaves turned, on a bright Sunday with the doors thrown open and the good bell rung. Mrs. Cobb cried in the front pew and made no secret of it. Half the valley filled the rest, the Hendersons, the Frys, men Jacob had threshed beside 20 years and not spoken to in 2. All of them come to see the widower Reed marry the woman who'd brought his place back from the dead. Sarah wore a dress the color of cream that Mrs. Cobb had helped her cut, and no veil, and walked up the aisle on no man's arm because she had none in the territory to give her. And Jacob thought she had never looked less like a thing a man could hire, and more like a thing a man could only be lucky enough to stand beside. Pruitt came. He sat near the back in his good coat and shook Jacob's hand after, hard, and said it was a fine thing, and meant it. And the second week after, a wagon Jacob didn't know came up the lane, not slow and pitying the way wagons used to come, looking at a place going under. This one came brisk, a merchant from 2 valleys over, who reined up in the green fence and looked down at the bottomland and the full cellar and the dairy, and took off his hat, and asked Jacob Reed if this was the place he'd heard of, the one a man could buy good cheese and seed potatoes and standing hay from, the finest little holding in the high country, and whether the owner was of a mind to sell. The merchant did not get to buy it. Nobody did. 3 more turnings of the year went over the place. 3 springs of runoff in the ditch, and 3 golden falls of cut hay, and the dry years gave way to fair ones. And the Reed homestead came up out of its own ruin into a thing people in that country spoke of by name. A man coming up the lane now in the gold of an autumn morning would not have known it for the place the land had been swallowing. The barn stood square and re-roofed, its swayback jacked out and braced. The house wore fresh whitewash, and the porch step held firm under a boot, and along the front of it ran a row of Sarah's flowers, gone wild and bright against the boards. The garden made more truck than 2 families could eat, and the rest went to Dunbar in a wagon. A hired boy drove twice a week. Down the creek, the bottomland ran green and deep, fenced clean, the ditch threading silver through it, and the dairy herd had grown from 2 cows to 14, and the cellar held more cheese than the whole valley had any business eating, and bought it anyway, and asked for more. Jacob walked it most mornings before the work. The way a man walks a thing he can't quite believe is his to walk. He'd stop at the head gate and watch the water come through. He'd stand at the cellar door and breathe the cool smell of curing cheese. And often as not he'd end at the top of the lane and turn and look back down at the whole of it, laid out in the early light, and try and fail. To lay it over the picture he carried of a leaking bucket and a dead garden and a man who couldn't read his own wife's hand. He could read the hand now. Sarah had taught him, evenings, the small slanted letters that had once looked like bird tracks, and now he kept the ledger himself half the time. Eleanor's pages were still in the front of it, her careful sums from years gone by. The filed water right that had saved them all copied out in her hand, and after them, page on page, Sarah's hand carried it forward. The cheese accounts, the hay sold, the cows freshened, the boys' wages, the seed bought. 2 women's writing in the one book, the dead one and the living one, and no quarrel between them on the page or off it. Some nights, Jacob sat with it open under the lamp and ran his thumb down both hands of it and felt no grief in it at all anymore, only a kind of fullness he had no word for and didn't need one. Word of the place had gone out past the valley by then. The merchant from 2 valleys over came back twice a year and never did get to buy anything but cheese and seed potatoes. A man from the territorial paper rode out one spring and stood at the head gate, writing in a little book, while Sarah told him, plain as she told everyone, that there was no secret in it, that the water had always been there, and somebody had only had to bother. He wrote it down wrong, made it sound like luck, and they laughed about it after. Hollis Pruitt bought their hay every fall now, and stayed for coffee when he came, and had got to be something near a friend, in the gruff way of men who'd once measured each other over water. He'd sit in Eleanor's rocking chair on the porch. It got sat in now, all the time, by whoever came up tired, and tell Jacob he'd been a fool not to take the 800 when it was offered, and laugh, because they both knew which of them had been the fool. There was a child by then, a girl, 2 years old that fall, brown-headed and stubborn as her mother, who rode the wagon to town on Sarah's lap and had her own small spade with a handle Jacob had cut down to her size, and who'd folded over 100 times and who'd already learned to follow the water down the ditch on her fat legs and crouch and put her hand flat against the wet ground the way she'd seen her mother do it, as if she were listening to something the rest of them had to be taught. On the morning it happened, Jacob was up at the top of the lane, with the child on his shoulders, looking back down at the place the way he did, when he heard a horse on the road behind him. He turned. A young man on a tired horse had reined up at the bend, dust on him from a long ride. Looking down the lane at the green bottomland, and the square barn, and the whitewashed house, with the flowers along the porch, looking at it, the way men used to look at Pruitt's place, the way Jacob himself had once looked at land that other men had made bloom. "Mister," the young man said, taking off his hat, "pardon me. I've been 3 days riding through country burned brown as a biscuit, and then I come around that bend, and there's this." He gestured down at the whole green length of it, at a loss. Finest little holding I've seen in 500 miles. How in the world does a man make a place like that, out here? Jacob Reed didn't answer right away. He looked off down the field, past the green run of the bottomland, to where a woman stood at the lower fence in the gold morning light, driving staples into a new set post. Her sleeves rolled, and a strand of brown hair come loose against her cheek. She'd felt him looking, the way she always did, and she straightened and lifted one dirt-streaked hand toward the top of the lane, toward him and the child on his shoulders, and went back to her work. "I'll tell you true," Jacob said, "though you'll not believe the half of it." He shifted the girl's weight on his shoulders. The child watched the woman at the fence and reached one small hand down the lane toward her. "I came into this valley, a widower with a played-out quarter and no notion how to keep it. Couldn't make butter, couldn't read my own ledger. I sent away to an agency for a woman to milk my 2 cows and keep the house from falling in on me, and that was all I had sense to ask for." He smiled, and it reached all the way up into him. "I hired her to milk the cows," he said, "but she built a whole life for us." The young man looked down at the place a while longer and put his hat back on and said he was obliged, and rode on south toward the dry country with something to think about. Jacob lifted the child down off his shoulders and set her on her feet, and she was already running, fat-legged and certain, down the green lane toward her mother at the fenceway. He followed her. There was no hurry in it. The water ran clean in the ditch beside them, and the morning was long, and the woman at the fence was waiting, and there was the whole of the day's work yet to do, and all the days after.